Here's a guy who thinks miracles are possible.
Christopher Hitchens often shrewdly painted his debate opponents out to be enemies of science. He'd often ask, do you really believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? Do you really believe that he rose from the dead? If the Christian answered yes, Hitchens would then turn to his audience and say, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, my opponent has just demonstrated that science has done nothing for his worldview. Hitchens was following the reasoning of the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume famously argued that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish.
A miracle is a purported violation of a law of nature. This is impossible by definition because a law of nature is defined as a regularity that is never violated. If you ever see a violation of a law of nature, that would just mean that it wasn't really a law.
Hume was so confident about this principle that he said, I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will, with the wise and learned, be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures.
Well, yeah. Why is it not perfectly reasonable to treat any testimony about anything as suspect unless the occurrence of the purported event were more probable than one of the many ways in which testimony can be incorrect? If somebody tells you anything about any subject, not just miracles, there's always the possibility that said person is lying, mistaken, or delusional. When weighing the likelihood that what they are saying is true, you should always estimate whether the truth of what they are saying is more probable than any of those potential fallibilities inherent to testimony.
So yeah, Hume was quite the humble guy. Hume argued that a wise person should always proportion his beliefs according to the best possible evidence. When it comes to evidence, we know from experience that human testimony can often be wrong. People can lie or believe they saw things that just weren't there. On the other hand, we have boatloads of evidence from our everyday experience that nature's laws are well established. Every second of the day, more evidence accumulates for supposing the laws of nature aren't violated. The cat knocks your glass off the desk, that's more evidence for the laws of gravity. You turn on your flashlight and the chemical energy of the batteries is converted into electrical energy, which is converted into light and heat energy, proving again that the law of conservation of energy works. Or think about this. Every single person that you know is the result of sexual reproduction and not an immaculate conception. And every person that you're aware of that has died and has remained dead is evidence that dead people stay dead. So according to Hume's logic, you're going to need a ginormous pile of evidence to overcome all the evidence for the laws of nature as revealed to us by science.
Even if there is a God and that God performs miracles, they seem to be so rare that pretty much any other possible explanation is more probable. When presented with explanations that vary in probability, why wouldn't you go with the most probable one?
And you don't want to come out as anti-science, do you? Summarizing his argument, Hume wrote, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And because firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the case against a miracle is, just because it is a miracle, as complete as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined to be. That's Hume's in-principle argument against miracles in a nutshell, and many skeptics believe that this is a knockdown argument. Game over. Arguments for the resurrection of Jesus can't get off the ground.
Even if we do see what we thought was a law of nature being broken, why would it not be more reasonable to infer that we were mistaken to believe it to be a law of nature to begin with? Scientists do sometimes observe phenomena that defy established laws of physics. The law of conservation of parity was once thought to apply to every fundamental force, but experiments show that the weak nuclear force violates it. When this happened, scientists did not interpret this to be a miracle. They just realized that what they thought was a universal law was not, in fact, universal.
But I don't think his argument is the slam dunk that skeptics think that it is. What Hume is doing is he's presenting us with a false dilemma. As many of Hume's contemporary critics astutely have pointed out, you can't use the regular order of nature as evidence against miracles. Nonplussed by Hume's essay, William Adams wrote, an experienced uniformity in the course of nature has always been thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. It is strange, therefore, that this uniformity, which is implied in the nature of a miracle, should at the same time be inconsistent with it.
Well, if you find an exception to what you thought was a uniformity, then that exception proves that it was not, in fact, a uniformity to begin with, by definition. That's why the observed violation of the law of conservation of parity wasn't declared a miracle. It just resulted in the revision of the law. If you want to convince me that a guy rose from the dead, I'd have to see his brain in a state of necrosis with my own eyes, and I'd have to directly witness him get up and walk around. Even then, while I would be convinced that resurrection is possible, I would still not infer that it was a miracle. I would rather infer that there was some heretofore undiscovered natural phenomenon that makes resurrection possible. And why shouldn't I? Why would that not be a perfectly reasonable inference?
To help us better understand using less 18th century speak, here's an argument from philosopher Tim McGrew. Premise number 1. In religious contexts, miracles are supposed to function as signs. Premise 2. Miracles that functions as signs would be impossible unless they took place against the backdrop of a stable order of nature, since that is what enables them to function as signs. Therefore, premise 3, the existence of a stable order of nature cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious contexts.
But how would you tell the difference between a violation of a perceived regularity in nature being a sign from God and it being proof that said perceived regularity was not really a regularity at all? Should the scientists who discovered that the weak nuclear force violates the law of conservation of parity have interpreted that as God trying to tell them something?
So if people were routinely rising from the dead, the resurrection of Jesus would lose all its cachet. It wouldn't be an event that could be distinguished from the way that nature operates normally. Precisely because it is a massive interruption of the regularities of nature, that we can actually appeal to the resurrection as God's vindication of the claims of Jesus of Nazareth to be God's Son.
Even if Jesus did rise from the grave, one could interpret that as a corroboration of the idea that his Father is God, but it is not a vindication. The fact that he has the power to return from the dead in no way vindicates the idea that his Father is all-powerful. Again, even if I saw a guy rise from the dead, and even if he said his Father is God, I would still infer that something entirely natural was occurring. In fact, even if I believed in God, mere testimony would never convince me that a person rose from the dead, because God seems to resurrect people so rarely that the odds of that testimony coming from someone who is lying, mistaken, or delusional is still far more probable.
The ancients weren't dummies. They knew that virgins don't get pregnant, and dead people normally remain dead. You see, anyone can claim to speak for God using eloquent words. Muhammad dared his critics to write verses superior to the Quran as proof of its inspiration. And the Book of Mormon says that if you ask God to show you the truth, you'll sense a burning in your bosom that Mormonism is the real deal. I have to say I'm very sympathetic to those who find the Mormon or Muslim challenges unpersuasive, but turning water into wine or rising from the dead is another matter altogether. Nicodemus understood this when he said to Jesus, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs that you're doing if God were not with him."
Why not? Why is Nicodemus assuming that having the power to do exceptionally weird things can only be explained by those powers coming from God? If Nicodemus had met Chen Sheng Wu, the lady who ran the experiment that violated the law of conservation of parity, would he infer that she was sent from God as well?
God's not a dumb bunny. He wouldn't rent a billboard and use a white font against a white background. Philosopher William Paley was living during the same time as Hume, and regarding miracles serving as signs, this is what he wrote. He said, "Now in what way could a revelation be made but by miracles? In none which we are able to conceive."
Why couldn't God just use his words like a normal person?
Consequently, in whatever degree it is probable, or not very improbable, that a revelation should be communicated to mankind at all, in the same degree it is probable, or not very improbable, that miracles should be wrought. Here's the bottom line. If there is a God, and he wants to make a revelation clear, then miracles aren't improbable. They're bound to happen at some point in history.
Since a miracle is a violation of a law of nature, and laws of nature by definition are never violated, the occurrence of miracles would effectively mean that there are no laws of nature. If there are no laws of nature to violate, then violations can't occur. In other words, miracles can't happen.
I'll wrap up with this. Paley also argued that when a theorem is proposed by a mathematician, the first thing you want to do is test it. If your theorem doesn't match up with reality, then something went wrong somewhere and it's time to go back to the drawing board.
Well, you wouldn't test it unless it made claims that had empirical consequences. This is more likely something a physicist would do, not a mathematician.
There's something sketchy about Hume's reasoning, and we can prove that out by running a simple test case. Here's Paley again with a money quote. He says, "If 12 men whose integrity and good sense I had long known should seriously and circumstantially relate to me an account of a miracle wrought before their eyes, and in which it was impossible that they should be deceived."
Why would it be impossible that they be deceived? How could you possibly rule that out? Even if they have solid reputations for honesty, it wouldn't violate any laws of physics for them to be lying. So if they're saying a law of physics was broken, lying would still be more probable.
If the governor of the country, hearing a rumor of this account, should call these men into his presence and offer them a short proposal, either confess to the imposture or submit to be tied up to a gibbet. If they should refuse with one voice to acknowledge that there existed any falsehood or imposture in their case, if this threat was communicated to them separately, yet with no different effect, if it was at last executed, if I saw them myself, one after another, consenting to be racked, burned, or strangled, rather than to give up the truth of their account, Still, if Mr. Hume's rule be my guide, I am not to believe them.
First of all, this is not analogous to what happened to the followers of Jesus. There is no evidence at all that they were persecuted specifically for their belief in the resurrection. Secondly, even if they were, that would still not convince me that a guy rose from the dead. The possibility that they were deceived would still be more probable. In fact, as unlikely as it seems, the possibility that they were lying would still be more probable to me than a guy actually returning from the dead.
Now I undertake to say that there exists not a skeptic in the world who would not believe them, or who would defend such incredulity.
Paley must not have met many skeptics.
Hume's in-principle argument sounds a lot like common sense, but it is vastly overrated. It's not the everlasting check that he proposes it out to be. Unless we want to beg the question for atheism, then there's no reason to assume that nature is left to itself. And you can't pit miracles against the laws of nature because nature's laws are necessary for identifying a miracle.
But nature's laws can't identify a miracle because if miracles occur, nature doesn't have any laws.
The Apostle Paul's rhetorical question is still pointed today. Why should anyone think that it is incredible that God should raise the dead?
Because God is a nonsensical idea to begin with. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.